For those of you who don't know me, my name is Martha Bachuk. I am joint appointed in the departments of history and political science. And I'm delighted to see so many of you here on this occasion where 3 years ago, Russia escalated its war against Ukraine. And a few weeks ago, the Americans elected a new president, and he has shifted his entire discourse to reflect that of Russian President Putin. And when I was thinking about these events, I happened to have a conversation with my dear friend, former ambassador of Canada to Ukraine, the Honorable Roman Vasyuk. And we were talking about this, and he said, what I notice is that Trump is using Putin's rhetoric in his discussions towards Canada. And say that again? Louder. Okay, they said the microphone would work, but I guess I have to speak louder. Okay, I will do my best. So I said, would you be willing to speak on that topic of the Canada-US, Russia-Ukraine asymmetrical relationship? And he said, sure. And I said, wonderful, thank you. And then the ambassador said, why don't you invite two of your colleagues from political science who can speak about Canada and the US? So I reached out to Matt and Adam, and they said yes. And so here we are. We're going to have a discussion as opposed to formal presentations. I hope you can hear. Vicky, you're saying you can. Okay, great. For those people who couldn't make it, we're recording the session. So important public service announcement. If you do not want to be recorded, then don't sit near the front. But we've set up the cameras in such a way that you probably won't be recorded. But if you have an issue with that, please sit at the back. I'd like to introduce our speakers very briefly. The Honorable Roman Vasyuk. He was Canada's ambassador to Ukraine from 2019 to 2024. Louder. Okay, before that, he served in many other diplomatic postings. He retired, but he's a man who cannot stay retired. So he is now Canada, the business ombudsman of Ukraine, and he is joining us from Kyiv. And I hope the connection lasts. Thank you so much for the idea and for joining us. My wonderful colleagues from the Political Science Department, Professor Matthew Lebo, who's an expert on American politics, has been commentating on various media outlets about what's happening. My other wonderful colleague, Professor Adam Harms, who's an expert on Canada, trade, economics, international political economy, and he has in the past served in the Canadian Armed Forces. So he has a very interesting perspective. I'd like to thank a few people before we get into our discussion. Professor Valerie Osterville. When I came up with this idea, she was the first one who said, absolutely, let's co-sponsor this with the TJ Center. So here we are in this wonderful space. Thank you very much. The Ukrainian Students Club are also one of the sponsors. They are doing a fundraiser in the hall for those of you who would like to support the Departments of History and Political Science, the Ukrainian community that's just coming in. Come on in. There's a few more seats. There's a seat up here. And there's one seat here. And maybe we'll figure, there's a seat up here. You can have this chair. So let's get started. We're going to have to stop at 5 minutes to 1 because there's a topic in here right after. So the format will be, I'm going to ask a question and then throw it open to our speakers. And then we'll have a conversation. And then for the last 10 minutes, you guys get to ask questions. So yesterday, we saw Russia voting with the United States voting with Russia at the United Nations against Ukraine. This is such a change in the geopolitical alliances. Those of us who've been watching this for the past few weeks might not be that surprised because American president has been saying nice things about the Russian president, speaking with him, inviting him back into the international community. At the same time, he is criticizing Canada and saying that Canada is not really a country. Canada will be the 51st state, using a lot of the same rhetoric that we've heard coming out of Putin, out of Russia and Putin towards Ukraine. Ukraine's not a real country, etc., etc. Ambassador Verstook, what are your thoughts about this? Where is this coming from? What does this all mean?
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Professor DeChook. When we initially talked about this about 4 weeks ago, yeah, we kind of thought could be an interesting topic, but then would people really see the parallels?
Yes.
Well, thanks to the Trump administration, I think they've become fairly blindingly obvious. I think the most recent echo, I think, came a couple of hours ago when Elon Musk responding to news that there is a Canadian petition to cancel his Canadian citizenship, tweeted or xed or whatever he does, Canada is not a real country. Which presumably he shouldn't need the citizenship of an unreal country. Um, but I think that reflects uh, what's happening at, me as a dyed-in-the-wool transatlanticist who's worked on Canadian political and security policy, NATO framework. Basically, the framework of my whole career has kind of collapsed in the last 4 weeks. But I think what I see is the danger that some of my ex-colleagues, current colleagues, still want to believe it's there. And I think it's kind of not. And we need to kind of try and pick up the pieces quickly. Um, in terms of Ukraine, economic pressure was what was applied in 2013, 2014, when Russia was very displeased that Ukraine was trying to join not NATO, but trying to sign an association agreement with the European Union, primarily economics focused, public governance standards focused, that sort of thing. And at that point, suddenly, Ukrainian agricultural products stopped meeting Russian norms. Ukrainian shipments to Central Asia suddenly couldn't pass phytosanitary inspection and were held up, couldn't make it to Kazakhstan, etc. So there was a concerted campaign of economic pressure, ultimately also in the form of President Putin saying, I'll buy you guys, especially President Yanukovych, if you don't sign the treaty with the Europeans, I will lend you the $15 billion you need because you've been running a spendthrift budgetary policy and save you politically. Unfortunately, for President Yanukovych, the Ukrainian people decided otherwise, and then mass protests emerged. So, to my mind, and again, no two situations are entirely alike, but Canada is kind of in a late 2013 Ukraine phase, where the pressure is economic, administrative. What we saw today, and it's appeared in the Financial Times just a couple of hours ago, is that there are rumors that the US, or at least part of the administration, Peter Navarro and some of his buddies, want to cut Canada out of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement. So suddenly we're going from strictly economic pressure, tariffs, to potentially national security pressure, nonviolent, but nonetheless very strong security component. So, you know, uh, as I say, given that I've spent a lifetime in the Canadian Foreign Service and I'm sitting in Ukraine, I tend to see parallels. Um, but it, it I'll maybe sort of uh, end off by suddenly flashing back, or at least panning out to the bigger picture, and that is that both Canada and Ukraine suffer from being located next to very big and very well-known countries. In the sense that if Canada or Ukraine were located anywhere else than next to Russia or next to the US, they would be seen as large, fairly important, fairly confident middle powers. Because they're right next to huge, uh, overwhelmingly interesting, uh, continental powers, they're seen as kind of, or they're not seen at all sometimes internationally. They're like flyover country. Or you need to be a particular area specialist or to have gotten a grant 10 years ago from a previous Canadian government to study Canada or to study Ukraine. Um, so, so I think this be asymmetrical relations with a big neighbor located right next to you is an objective similarity between the two situations, which affects both the mentality of the people living in the countries, but also the way the rest of the world relates to them. Never mind the big, huge neighbor who can be okay, benign, but if that big, huge neighbor goes toxic, then you're in real trouble.
Indeed. Thank you. Matt, Adam, who wants to go next? Go ahead.
Thanks for all that. I guess I'll try and jump in on a couple of similarities and differences, obviously, between Putin and Trump's behavior. As Roman said, I think there's definitely some clear parallels, but also differences. So I think where I would see the parallels would be both Putin and Trump share a kind of, or at least stem from a kind of common ideological, worldview of a kind of conservative nationalism with, in Trump's case, authoritarian leanings, in Putin's case, straight up authoritarianism. And I think that common denominator is what leads to a view that, only great powers matter, right, in that worldview. So all other powers, including middle powers, whether it be Ukraine, Canada, et cetera, don't matter. They're not really real countries, or, they can be diminished easily. It's also a worldview that believes in, power politics. And trafficking in misinformation is absolutely viable tools to achieve national interests, as opposed to a rules-based order using negotiation and multilateralism and things like that. So I think that's where they also share a commonality. Trump is absolutely willing to traffic in misinformation all the time. We see this with all the 51st state stuff, et cetera. And just again, the power politics, a move away from that multilateralism towards bilateralism and a willingness to put a lot of pressure on other countries to achieve their aims. And this goes beyond Canada, of course. Where I do think there's, clear differences, though, is I'm not a fan of Trump, but, he's still not Hitler, right? And we didn't want to call him that. He's also not Putin. He's also not Putin. Maybe that will happen, but that's not where we're at, right? And so my own view is that I think the 51st state stuff is, it is about misinformation. It is about trying to destabilize us. It is about putting maximum pressure on Canada to achieve economic ends. But, I don't think we're at risk of being militarily invaded. I don't think Trump has the same freedom of action that Putin does as an actual dictator, right? I'm not saying Trump is a nicer person, but the United States, however diminished their democracy is still has a number of the trappings of democracy that do act as a constraint on Trump's power, including public opinion, including, to some degree, the courts and the Congress, these sorts of things. So I can see a fair bit of economic pressure coming toward us to achieve more, some economic gains, some security gains. But I think the 51st state thing is, unlikely. You never know. I would never say 100%, right? But I would still say that's unlikely. So similarities, but also differences.
Thank you, Matt. What do you think?
So thinking about what Trump is doing now and comparing it to what he did in his first term, think about major differences in American domestic politics. In 2017, he had gotten the Republican nomination, despite about 60% of Republicans voting for someone else during the primaries. He was facing Speaker of the House, Ryan, John Boehner, John McCain, a whole host of Republicans who weren't so happy with him, but that he had to, work with. His choices for cabinet positions, people like Rex Tillerson, generals, chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, these were all constraints that were on him. where he worked. He was certainly a different politician than previous presidents, but he was working within a system and with the kinds of people who look, okay, Republican, pretty conservative, pretty far on the right for a Republican, but still parts of the Republican Party. This term is extremely different from that. Right? A lot of the people who were constraining him within the Republican Party are long gone. He, of course, had no problem getting the Republican nomination this time. He has surrounded himself with people who do not constrain him at all, but only enable and amplify his rhetoric. So people like Musk, but also Hegseth as the Secretary of Defense. These are really dangerous people, and there isn't a voice of reason. If anybody has a voice of reason right now, they're getting fired. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs and not just the people in the high positions, but the people who watch the people in high positions. All the watchdogs and the inspectors general, all these things are taken off. So if we, I don't want to go to Hitler comparisons or even Putin comparisons, because I don't, it's not my area. But the version of Donald Trump that we saw in his first term isn't necessarily, that's not necessarily the extent of his ambitions or his worldview. That his first term did include all sorts of domestic constraints that I think are long gone. The Republican Party now is his Republican Party. If in 2017 he had talked about Canada as the 51st state, then maybe you would have seen, half a dozen of his competitors from the Republican primaries speaking up and saying, no, this is ridiculous, this is a bad joke, or something. Instead, now you see he's surrounded by people who say, well, why is Canada its own country, or other stuff that sort of backs him up. Right. So the way that the Republican Party works now is that members of the House and senators and governors, they cannot anger Trump voters and hope to get reelected. They see no path to continue their careers by taking a stand against Donald Trump. The only two members of the House of Representatives who took stands against Donald Trump, Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, are long gone. Right? That they cost them their careers. Members of the Senate who stood up to Donald Trump, Mitt Romney, long gone. Who are the people that are constraining him? So, what does he really want to do? Well, I don't see, deep policy objectives in Donald Trump. We can think about what the advantages might be to the United States. Okay, you scare Canada and eventually you get a better trade deal. I don't know that, that there's any deep thinking to that. He sees large pieces of land and he wants to grab them like he wants to grab anything that he wants.
But
right?
isn't that worrying?
Of course it is. Yes. No, I'm plenty worried. About military invasion, less so maybe today. But this is, it's pretty frightening. He's obviously in his first term, we saw the kind of people that he admires in the world. Putin is one of them, and he has no problem changing decades of U.S. foreign policy and alliances, walking away from relationships like NATO or NAFTA. And what does it serve? It serves him. He's not even when we think about, well, doesn't this hurt the U.S.? Like probably all of you, when you're going shopping now, you're looking on the shelves and seeing where things are made. This will cost the United States billions and billions of dollars, and he doesn't care at all. Just to tweet something out because he likes to do it, or to, whatever. He's not thinking about the consequences. It's just bullying because that's who he is. So I don't look for, deep, long-term goals in what he does, but I do see that when he says something, all the people he surrounded himself with rally behind him. No matter what he says, he has a party behind him. He's now the dear leader, and it's very, very different than 8 years ago.
This is so worrying. I agree with everything you said, but the question in my mind is, why is he repeating Putin's narrative? The fact that he's the megalomaniac and he cares about himself and doesn't worry about democracy in the US, but he's repeating what Putin is saying. And this is the part that I don't understand. And this is the part that worries me because, the words are followed by actions, right? So, Ambassador,
Let me take a slightly conspiratorial view of this, or rather more like ideological view. I think it is true that Trump himself is a non-ideological opportunist and kind of flaky in certain respects. His previous vice president, Mike Pence, was a kind of standard Republican who now looks like a paragon of virtue compared to Trump and what he's been up to. But JD Vance, JD Vance is a thinker. He's the guy from Yale. And he is somebody who comes out of the American New Right, and where he's hung out with guys like this fellow Curtis Yarvin, sort of a lead thinker of that area, who is very much believes that tech bro CEOs are the new sort of Nietzschean supermen of our era. Now, obviously, that would appeal to certain tech bro CEOs, and that democracy is over. And what you need is sort of semi-monarchic rule in continental realms. So therefore, Western Hemisphere, therefore Russia. The guy literally wrote an essay saying Russia should take Europe, not just Ukraine, Europe. And then China, naturally, in East Asia. These are people who spend a lot of time together in American. I think it's the so-called NatCon universe, National Conservative Movement, which was funded by Peter Thiel, another ex-South African tech bro CEO. The connection is on the Russian side to people like Ivan Ilyin, who was the inspiration for Putin in the 2000s, sort of semi-fascist philosopher of the 1930s and 40s, and then picked up by Alexander Dugin. And people have often said, "Oh, Dugin's like this totally marginal guy. He's just a boogeyman for Western analysts." But you now have Musk retweeting little videos of Dugin. So if you kind of wonder where is the common ideology coming from, it is from this sort of great power, continental, sort of Nietzschean Superman or Orthodox super Tsar sort of thing. So it's super Tsar on the Russian side, it's super tech bro worship on the American side, all being and in the U.S. system being channeled at this guy who is, in personality terms, willing to say or do almost anything. Whereas he himself may not have this great idea and may lurch from statement to statement, some of the people around him have more of an idea of what it is they're trying to achieve through Project 2025, all these things, which I think, as your second colleague pointed out, means that this Trump presidency has been much more systematic in taking charge of all the levers of power. That may sound a bit dark, but I think it might go some way to explaining where the ideological affinity is not so much between Trump himself, but between sort of the Vance orbit and the Russians.
fascinating, scary, huh? What do you think?
Yeah, there's definitely undemocratic elements, or really that's too mild. I can't say anything that I've seen from Donald Trump in 9 years in politics that showed that he had respect for democracy. Right, there were things that he was stopped from doing, but he hasn't mentioned Congress yet in his second term. Everything is executive orders, talking about courts like they can be ignored. He's not just radically changing policy towards Ukraine, but also towards Israel, people of Gaza, other parts of the world. So everything could just be thrown out based on his whims. And I think for him also, a lot of things are at a personal level. And so, he was impeached for trying to get the president of Ukraine to launch an investigation of Joe Biden. He refused that request. And then Donald Trump gets, humiliated through an impeachment trial. Of course, that can be a big part of why which side he's chosen in his second term. I still think that his feelings about Canada have a lot to do with the fact that you can go online and find pictures of Ivanka Trump and Melania Trump looking adoringly at Justin Trudeau. And I think that, as much as anything else, explains why Donald Trump has disdain for Trudeau in Canada. And also that these big land masses just look like real estate projects to him, and he likes owning stuff.
So you're saying the personal is driving the political?
It's just all him feeding his needs that can't be met.
That's interesting. I hadn't connected that phone conversation with Zelensky with what's happening now, but I think you're right. I think that personal sort of insult he hasn't forgotten. But he's making huge changes globally. But I want to get Adam in on this, the Canadian threat.
I guess where I would come is to say, I agree with Matt. I think that personal aspect is 100% there, going back to Zelensky and that phone call and Zelensky standing up to him, refusing to launch the investigation into Biden and Biden's son and all the rest of it. I also agree that Trump is scattershot and not like an ideological purist. But I would still make the case that everything he is doing, to the extent that personnel is policy, like Matt said, we've seen a huge difference in the personnel he's hired between this administration and his first administration. In his first administration, they were not ready. A lot of the people who were hired, a number of the ones Matt mentioned who were in defense, a lot of the generals that were hired, they came from a different kind of, ideological faction within the Republic. We would be more neoconservatives. This is why some of Trump 1.0 was a bit unpredictable in the sense that it were inconsistent. Whereas when you look at the personnel he has hired this time, the number one characteristic I agree is they're basically dear leader loyalists, 100%. But almost all of them do, pretty consistently fall into, as Roman said, this conservative nationalist camp. Like this camp is built up, so you do have deep thinkers like J.D. Vance and, Navarro on the economic side and others. And it's all a consistent approach, economically, politically, it believes in isolationism, but it believes in great power. So it's the idea of, isolationism from the rest of the world, but retreating to the Western hemisphere, that basically each of the great powers should be allowed their own hemisphere. So I do think he wants greater control of the Western hemisphere. That's why he sort of it's consistent to be, more isolationist everywhere else, but quasi-expansionist within the Western hemisphere. Hence Panama, hence Greenland. I still, maybe I'm, being Panglossian or something, but I still don't think we're getting invaded, right? I think there's going to be a lot of economic coercion. I think there's going to be, I think he would take it, if he kind of floats out these trial balloons and if all of a sudden Canada, there's a groundswell and said, hey, we'd love to join the States. I think he would love it. That for him would be, that's how he gets his face on Mount Rushmore, right? But realistically, I think a more likely possibility would be, the young people here won't remember, but if you think back after 9/11, when the borders were all closed and all this, the Canadian business community and conservatives here proposed this idea of a security and prosperity partnership to take pressure off the internal border. So you basically go to a customs union, go to a security prosperity or a greater security integration. I think we could easily see some of that. I do think there's going to be economic coercion, but I do think it's more about achieving. They have a traditionalist. If you go to Navarro and the more trade expert peoples, Marin, others, a lot of the stuff they want is the traditional list of grievances that the United States has had against us, including some new ones: softwood lumber, steel, digital services tax that we've implemented recently, a number of things like this. They want those addressed. They want our NATO spending minimum 2%. They want a base in the Arctic, which at some point we may need because no matter how much we increase our military spending, we're not going to be able to control the Arctic on our own. But yeah, I could be entirely wrong, and we could be getting invaded. So, stockpile weapons just in case. Training for insurgency, but I'm not counting.
Thank you. You sort of took the discussion where I wanted to go next and looking forward. So we've analyzed what Trump is, what Putin is, but the relationship, I'd like to turn it back to the relationship between Putin and Trump. And what does that spell in terms of Canada and the US, but also global affairs? And I don't know who wants to go first on this. Roland?
Take a stab. I think the Putin-Trump relationship will be very good, certainly in the next couple of weeks and months. How durably, not sure. What it's doing, though, and we already saw this here in Kiev yesterday on the 24th, it's created this alternate geometry of countries that still overtly support Ukraine, which is basically EU. Literally the entire EU College of Commissioners, over 20 of them were here yesterday. It's like a cabinet meeting happening here, along with the president of the council, president of the commission, plus about 12 or 13 heads of government and state, plus Canada. Now, you could partly attribute that to sort of a farewell tour by Prime Minister Trudeau, but I think also sticking with a certain policy on Ukraine is also a form of assertion or self-assertion for the countries that showed up in Kiev, because they didn't show up with empty hands. So I think if you put it all together, close to $20 billion in commitments were delivered yesterday. Canada came up with 5 point something Canadian money, plus 25 LAV3s from London, Ontario, I'd like to point out. So that's good news for the local London, Ontario economy, plus some other stuff. But the British with, I think, six or 7 billion, et cetera. So it was partly to show that they actually had agency of their own. Not only the Ukrainians, but the partners of the Ukrainians. And so I think what's going to be interesting to see is this kind of Putin-Trump dynamic of trying to create fait accompli through their talks, and then how the Europeans, Canada, maybe Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, others react. Because we are seeing a huge shift in the international system. And, it's nice for the Americans to say you need to pay up to NATO, but with a president voting with Russia, what's the point of traditional NATO anyway? And that's why you have the new sort of German Chancellor-elect, Friedrich Merz, saying, I'm talking to the French about them providing the nuclear umbrella. It's time for us to emancipate ourselves from the Americans. And this is the guy who was the chairman of Atlantikbrücke, like pro-American lobby group #1 in Germany, until about, I think, 2023 or something. So the change is coming really fast. Canada is swept into it both as an actor and as an object of pressure. So I'm not sure if Newtonian physics will explain this, but actions are generating reactions.
Very well put. So the US allied with Russia, Canada now allied with the Europeans, future of NATO, future of security, and which one of you was certain?
Well, the US has led most of the world in most things for 80 years. Science, technology, climate, security. And they've just stepped back from that incredibly quickly. And yeah, other countries are scrambling. And Canada should be working with other countries around the world to try and decrease its reliance on the United States. I mean, it's impossible for some sectors of our economy, but Canada should be building new relationships, especially on, everything's just connected. So if the United States is going to kill all of its climate goals and it's going to purposefully pump out more carbon into the atmosphere, then other countries that are going to suffer the consequences of climate change need to do everything they were going to do before, plus more, just for the things to not fall further behind. And then in trade and in security, they have to create some kind of credible threat to Russia or the United States to be secure without U.S. backing. So I'm sure that in Europe they're saying, well, if Ukraine were to fall and Putin were to continue going west, would the United States send in troops to defend its NATO allies? And I don't know why anybody would think that they would.
But isn't it not just that the US is stepping back, but it appears to be aligning itself with Russia? Like those two things are happening simultaneously. I mean, it's one thing if it's like, okay, we're not going to help you anymore. You guys are on your own. It's very different if we're going to be friends with the aggressor, right? Like that is the game changer that I can't get my head around. Because I don't know.
Yeah, and this is why it is gonna be bad. Like, I don't think we're getting invaded, but it's not like happy things are coming. So, I mean, as Matt said, on a lot of the domestic issues, like even Europe and Canada are gonna get pushed in a more, just one conservative direction. It is gonna be, there will be economically, if we want to be more self-reliant, that means it's gonna create more pressure to, improve pipelines and things like that, which are a huge problem for climate, right? It will create increased pressures for military spending, for self-sufficiency. The trade side is very difficult because, again, it's not two countries who make stuff and trade with each other. It's a continental supply chain where the eggs are scrambled, and pulling those apart is super difficult. So there would be a ton of short-term pain. We have signed a ton of trade agreements with other countries. The problem isn't so much the government side, it's business doesn't have an incentive to trade with, to actually move businesses or start to trade with other countries and export to them as much as long as the States is there. It's just cheaper and easier for all the reasons. Obviously, that changes the incentive structure. Like getting friendly with Putin, it's totally understandable. It goes back to, I think, what Roth said about, the kind of tech bro thing, but part of conservative nationalism, there's a very strong gendered element to this, right? Where, the machismo side of it is huge. That's why, I think obviously Trump likes Putin a lot. And part of it is this sort of view of hemispheres and great powers. So, these are the two that are going to get together and negotiate and kind of carve up the world. You can have this and we'll have this. But yeah, I don't see Trump, if Putin decided to go farther and go into Latvia or Estonia or anywhere else or Poland, I don't think the Americans would be there. I think it would be a problem, and that would be the end of NATO. Whether Trump will outright pull out of NATO, it's definitely possible. But either way, it puts pressure on us and the Europeans and the Australians and others to increase our alliances with each other. We are going to have to become more self-sufficient, which means more money is going to have to be devoted to those types of things. We do have options on trade. Like we could go back to free trade. It's hard, and the transition will be awful. Where we implement our own permanent tariffs and go back to what used to be called, import substitution industrialization, right? Where you basically say, if you want to make it in Canada or sell it in Canada, you'll have to make it in Canada. And that's how we got a lot of the branch plants in the first place. And but it's not a good option. But that may be where we're headed. The final point about Canada getting kicked out of the Five Eyes, which people aren't aware is our intelligence, sharing arrangement with the other essentially Anglo countries. I suspect it suddenly dawned on me that Trump has been making ramblings about getting Russia back into the G7. I could easily see the Five Eyes being Trump puts that on the table, and if Canada's willing to vote for Russia getting back in the G8, then maybe we'll let you stay in the Five Eyes. That will get kicked out of the G8. I don't know. But yeah, it's not going to be good, that's for sure.
I don't know if anybody would like to add anything, because I'd like to throw the floor open to discussion, but this is kind of, we're living through a difficult moment where the ground is shifting beneath our feet. And there was an article, Roman, that you shared that Trump is thinking of buying aluminum from Russia, or Russia's offering aluminum from, so Canada's getting thrown out of the, and I'm at a loss for words, but maybe if anybody wants a final comment, question, and then we'll throw it out to the audience. Ah, okay, speechless. Questions? I see Eli, Vicky, and oh,
So to what extent is Europe and Canada and other countries who are still in the alliance against Russia and with Ukraine capable of taking the American role in supplying Ukraine with materials for its defense?
well, that's a question for Roman.
Yep. Okay. I think for this year, probably largely capable in most respects. Now, the Biden administration in its final months and weeks had front-loaded purchases and had already placed orders with American factories for things. Now, of course, somebody could simply stop them being shipped, which is another possibility. But if those contracts are respected, secondly, the Europeans now supply many of the things that are most necessary for Ukraine. Now, I note that 2024, because the Congress was stuck for nearly half a year on aid to Ukraine because of the Republicans. Canada and the European Union, not in that order, the Europeans plus Canada, supplied 60% of Ukraine's military and financial needs. So it's not like we're starting from nothing. We're already starting from a fairly high starting place. Where things are going to get hairy is in intelligence sharing, back to the Five Eyes, but not only. So in other words, the Ukrainians have been quite reliant on US signals intelligence for where rockets are coming from, targeting, that sort of thing. Now, the French do have their own satellite system. Now, it's probably not as well developed as the American one. And the other thing is Patriot missiles, which have really been the only system that's proven itself adept at taking down ballistic missiles. Other systems that the Europeans make have been good at taking down cruise missiles and other sorts of pointy things flying through the sky. But it's really only the Patriots that have taken out ballistics, which are the most dangerous. So there are still stocks of ballistic of Patriot rockets in Europe, but that could become a constraint as well. Just maybe a final note. Yesterday, during the sort of commemoration of the 3 years of the full-scale war, there was kind of a technology show for visiting leaders, showing Ukrainian drones and missiles. Ukraine now makes over 90% of the drones it deploys. Now, some of them require parts from other parts of the world. And those drones account for 80% of the hits on, destroying equipment or destroying emplacements on the front. So it's no longer big rockets. It's no longer big tanks. It's drones. This is very much a drone war. And Ukraine is, in fact, ahead of nearly all other countries in the world in terms of developing drone solutions. So it may emotionally feel like 3 years ago. We're all alone, we're all abandoned, but the capabilities are considerably more developed than they used to be.
The Americans keep talking about an agreement with Ukraine, and that, this is the agreement to override another rail, minerals or whatever. What do you think is gonna happen with that? What do you think is in that agreement? What do you think Ukraine's gonna have to give up in order to have anything from the Americans?
Who wants to say that one?
Well, maybe you can do it.
Adam?
I mean, the agreement they're currently, Trump's trying to push right now is on critical minerals, right? They want, and some other revenue from ports and things like that. So the kind of maximalist Trump position is to, it is people use the word a little bit extortion, right? Where it's, I mean, what Ukraine would have to give up based on that deal is the critical minerals. You're basically saying like, they have a lot of these rare earth minerals and other things, that would be super valuable to sell that would help Ukraine build. And the idea is the United States would basically have a claim on about 50% of the revenues from that through a joint investment fund that would be set up. So what they're giving up is like half the revenue on some of their key natural resources. What they're hoping to get, which they're, I would assume, trying to get is some form of security guarantees, and unfortunately the Americans and Hegseth and others, the defense secretary, have already negotiated, given everything away before the negotiation began. So they said, no NATO membership. So that would obviously be the best security guarantee for Ukraine, that they're admitted to NATO, and therefore that creates a deterrent against any future attack. The Americans have already said, no to that. The Americans have said no to any US troops on the ground. So you start to look at other possible security guarantees. So, I mean, the realistic ones, you might get some European and Canadian troops on the ground, but that would be a tripwire force, which is not enough to actually defend against a Russian attack. It's the idea that you have kind of founding members of NATO, like their soldiers in Ukraine. So if Russia attacks, they're actually going to be killing, Brits and Europeans and Canadians and whatnot, and that ups the stakes in terms of all of us having to respond. So that's what's in Latvia right now. NATO has that type of mission in Latvia. The other big thing is, as was said, that Ukraine has massively ramped up their internal defense production. The size of their, I can't remember how many brigades they have now, but it's a lot, And one of their best realistic security guarantees is to get more weapons from the rest of NATO and possibly from the Americans, particularly long range, like ATACMS and HIMARS and some other, doesn't matter, missiles that can shoot all the way into Russia and not just be defensive. I mean, if they can get more Patriots, which are defensive, all of that would help, because that's a more realistic guarantee, because a lot of the guarantees on paper, I wouldn't trust them. I mean, Ukraine, as everybody I'm sure here knows, right? In the 90s, they gave up nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees. And the deal was, well, don't worry, you don't need nukes, because you get rid of them and we'll defend you if there's a problem. And, that didn't work out, right? The Budapest Memorandum has sort of been ignored. But anyway, yeah.
I mean, that's why Ukraine keeps saying we need security guarantees.
That's the key
Because
thing.
of weakness. We have one more question on the floor.
Wait,
Oh, Roman. go ahead.
Follow up on that. But this American, I think extortionate is a fair description, offer, is now being also countered by a European offer, saying, delivered yesterday, saying, we also would gladly help you develop your critical minerals, but not demand half of them as payment, and not categorize all of our past aid as a debt that you somehow owe us. So in a way, this, I think, is helping the Ukrainians because it gives them a bit more leverage in negotiation. I think the Americans have tried to say that the security guarantee is sort of implicit. So like if we have our capital or our mine manager somewhere in central eastern Ukraine, then that should be good enough for you. And the Ukrainians are not really buying into that. If there's, but I think also to remember, Ukraine is a candidate country for the European Union. And the Europeans have since 22, and they were saying it yesterday very loudly, you are one of us. We are part of the same family. They were talking about 2030 as the target date for full entry. Ursula von der Leyen was saying Ukraine is making very good progress on governance and sort of, legal reform issues, that sort of thing, which I can confirm. Implementation a bit iffy occasionally, but in terms of passing all those laws, yeah, they're doing very well. So you could think of sort of in a way as Ukraine being engaged to the European Union, Russia the spurned other suitor, and then if any of you remembers that classic Canadian movie My American Cousin, about a girl who suddenly this guy shows up, a Canadian beach somewhere. Guy shows up with this super flashy car and says, "Come with me. I'm so amazing. I'm so awesome." That's kind of the US, except it isn't really offering you a ride, is in fact trying to take all your jewelry and then maybe your cottage too. So that's kind of the situation.
Thank you. That's putting this wonderful spin on it, Audrey.
Okay, my question is about intelligence sharing. With Tulsi Gabbard at the helm and Putin fans in the US intelligence system, how do you see intelligence sharing in the near future? What's gonna happen with this? You were saying Canada's gonna be not included. Is that a good thing maybe, or?
I don't know, I mean, I think
Tulsi Gabbard, it's terrifying. Yeah, I can't imagine how those relationships are going to evolve over the next little while, but a difference between it's not just a difference. The current, Trump's appointees and the people overseeing so many key aspects of the US. It's not just okay that these are Christian nationalist versions of Republicans rather than it's that the old versions, the Trump one versions, were professionals and whatever it is that they were doing, and they understood what their jobs were. And Trump's put in so many people who are not professionals and can be manipulated just as he can be, or just have ends that have they don't have any kind of training to see what the consequences are of their actions. And so Gabbard's terrifying, Hegseth is terrifying, the new deputy director of the FBI, all terrifying.
Well, not just not professional, but I see in all of these people pro-Russian leaning. And that is not a great note to end on. But Roman, please, the last word to you.
Could I just add another little depressing note to end on, which is if you think about the people in Saudi Arabia negotiating, on the American side, they're all newbies of various descriptions. You've got a new Secretary of State who's never done that before. You've got this New York real estate guy who's suddenly like an international peace broker, et cetera. Whereas on the other side, you've got lifelong Soviet-trained Russian foreign ministry people. And so the likelihood that these particular Americans will be had by their very professional Russian counterparts is high. And so, so coming back to the intelligence sharing question, yes, on the one hand, there's sort of the Five Eyes and do we get kicked out or not? But a bit like NATO, if the United States kind of detonates the whole confidence factor on which these networks are built, then the value of being a member declines precipitously. But I think maybe it's just a slight little positive thing, and that's the sort of the emerging new geometries. And it's true for business. I think Canadian companies will be more motivated to look further, and similarly, intelligence sharing, new alliances, that sort of thing. So it'll be really exciting and super unsettling.
Super unsettling. I think that's a note to end on. Thank you very much to our speakers. My next question is, what's going to happen with the peace negotiations? But I think we need another seminar for that. Please join me in thanking Roman. While we're coming, a reminder, the Ukrainian Students Club is doing a fundraiser in the hallway. And anybody who took pictures, please share them with me. And, oh, yes, there's another announcement.
Yeah,
I forgot what you wanted me to announce. Please
yeah,
announce.
there's another showing of the documentary that we watched yesterday. It is a very, very special documentary. It's really a masterpiece, so I would really urge everyone to try and make it. It's on Thursday in Highland Cinema platform.
The film is called The Porcelain War.
Yes.
And it is Oscar nominated, Ukraine's entry. I was there yesterday, it's fabulous, Valerie was there, so yes, thank you very, very much. And until next time, thank you.